So basically, my paper is an attempt to show my thanks for being invited by taking up the suggestion of the write-up for this conference, which just to review as we approach the end here, looking for sort of either in Zhao Tingyang's original suggestion of the Chinese written system as the sort of source of the Biantong, in other words, the continuity and change that has allowed diversity and unity to coexist in the Chinese polity for a long time. And the second suggestion, I think we heard it a little bit from Roger just now, that maybe the what's missing there is the content of much of that canonical tradition, namely in family reverence. I'm trying to cut out the middleman and just think about Biantong itself as already functioning as something that fulfills the requirements of a minimalist morality, and translate it a little more literally as Bian, transformation, Tong, unobstructedness, and I'm going to talk about Tong. The related word Da also means unobstructed or getting through or being unblocked. And related to both of those, the word Nung. And the sort of quick elevator pitch version of this is to say these things, I'm also sort of drawing comparatively on a few what I call sort of contrarian positions in European thought, specifically Spinoza and Nietzsche, to that this characteristic of Biantong or of Tong itself, so if you don't mind, I will use the Chinese term, meaning connection or unobstructedness, already entails Bian, transformation, in itself. And in fact, there's sort of two ends of this. One, and I put this in the paper in terms of the simultaneous will to power as simultaneously a tautology and a self-contradiction, which also makes it a key sort of pivotal transformative concept that takes us from the ethical to the metaphysical, and I will try to trace some instances of that, specifically in early Chinese texts. But the point there is why tautological? The point is that, I think there's a whiff of this in Roger's way of approaching this question too. Unobstructedness or ability or the impulse or the necessity, the unavoidability of always acting in ways that are designed to overcome limits to activity. In other words, for power, is always de facto, always going on. And that means even in allegedly selfish actions, this is happening, and we have a question of a difference of extent where we have sort of small versions of attempts to increase motility of action in any action, qua action, but because the nature of action, and I want to argue even the nature with Spinoza in particular, the nature of pleasure, the nature of motivation as such, involves, and Nietzsche, the always de facto in operation impulse to be able to do more, so power defined in that way, to have limitations to activity suspended, this expansion of scope of this sort of originary impulse is built into it. And this is one of the things I see being tracked in Confucian texts on this topic. On the other side of that, that pushes all the way to the point where it is necessarily paradoxical. That is, that it must overcome itself, to use Nietzsche's term, which means into, as we see in some of the texts that we'll look at, precisely what apparently are not virtues at all, but the opposites of virtues. So the argument is really pretty simple from that point on, but the texts are quite interesting, I think, and I'd be interested in discussing them. For those of you who aren't familiar with the sources, this first passage, which I have on the screen now, everyone can see that? Is that okay? Is from a text called Liezi, which is characterized usually as a Taoist text, although it is using the person of Confucius to both sort of extend and in some ways parody Confucianism. So we have that a lot in the Zhuang, so this is a later text, but a really intriguing passage. So if you haven't read it, it's this dialogue between a disciple of Confucius and Confucius. He's asked about other disciples. In every case, Confucius says his disciples surpass him in the virtue under question. But then he's asked, well, then why are you the master and they the student? Since they're more one is more humane, one is more eloquent, one is more courageous, one is more authoritative or dignified. And Confucius says, remember, this is the Taoified kind of Confucius, says Yanhui has the power to be humane, but no power to be contrary, power to debate, but no power to be tongue-tied, power to be courageous, not cowardly. This is sort of the keynote of this whole theme, right? And the implication I'm taking from that is that the value of those things described as virtues really lay in the term actually in the text is nung, so that's one of my key words here, the ability to do more. And so the ability to do that one thing plus whatever seemed to be excluded from it is more of the same virtue. And in fact, any specifiable, definite, identifiable virtue, simply by virtue of being point outable, is a limitation of sorts. And so if you follow that line of thinking, we turn around, and here again I look towards Spinoza, not where on the issue of teleology, and especially moral teleology, that it involves not the pursuit of definite goals. We don't, actually Nietzsche makes this point too in a more pungent way, but that the goals are set up to just stimulate our ability to act. And once those goals are reached, they must be surrendered, they must be overcome, they must be contravened. And this goes for moral goals as well, right? That's sort of what is put forward in that Liezi passage. So in Spinoza's terms, we don't desire the good, we call good what we desire. And as Mencius says, 可欲之为善. For some of you, okay? And we will argue about the interpretation of that line, but I interpret it in the Spinozistic way, and I would track that out in the rest of that passage. So the point is, and so then I also go through some important text from Confucianism, one from Cheng Hao, which you have on the screen there, where he specifically talks about humaneness as expansiveness, that is, as the overcoming of the boundary between self and other, or between self and things, but also importantly, the other wing of this idea, that humaneness, human kindness, means overcoming the difference between human kindness and righteousness, between human kindness and ritual, between human kindness and wisdom, reliability, which importantly are on the face of it contrary to human kindness. So there's some discussion of that, and again, it involves a theme that May just mentioned: sincerity in introspection, which he takes from that same passage in Mengzi, which I take to mean that when those more limited forms of those things are understood correctly, they already involve the expansion of the ability to act and causally interact, if you like, or just to interact, whether they are in their narrow, let's say, selfish form or in their expanded benevolent form. And so this gets us to Analect 630, which is a really fun one to discuss in this context. but it's ji yu li or li ren, ji yu da or da. And there's da, that word again, da meaning the same as tong. I'm particularly want to stress the use of the word desire. Again, May mentioned this a moment ago. Desire in both of these passages, famously the Silver Rule passage, Ji so bu yu shi yu ren, what one desires not to do to others, what one desiring to stand up others, one desiring to da, to reach others, or to allow others to reach, or not really to reach. And this is where this very interesting Shuowen definition of da, right, 行不相遇, to move without meeting anything, without meeting an obstruction. So we can talk about that more in Q&A if you want to, but very interesting to me that li and da are both the description of what one already de facto is wanting, and that benevolence is the extension of that. And of course, da already being what one wants from oneself, one further das the da. One makes unobstructed that unobstructedness, or that will to unobstructedness. And again, that involves that. So there's a lot in the paper where I'm just trying to say all these ordinary desires for food, sex, position, fame, money can be viewed as various forms in their own spheres, not of trying to reach anywhere, but simply of trying to overcome a local limit to activity in one way or another, but that they are self-limiting, and that is sort of the point of that. This now being the Orthodox Confucian version of this, not the Taoified version of this, is that those things too end up being limits. And we could talk about this theme of chong or tui in Mencius, that is expanding or filling, or qingwang dazhi, please, I ask the king to expand it. That's guaren yoji, right? Guaren haosa and so on. The king says, he has a liking for wealth or for sex or for acts of daring, and Mencius says, all I'm asking you to do is expand it, right? So I'm just trying to root this not as a kind of wild surmise, but as something that's very much a through line in the Confucian tradition, but that is kind of taken to the next step in this Taoified version, which face to face confronts the fact that this also means it's not a different idea that requires the limitation put on morality itself. It's that morality is a way of overcoming limits, and morality becomes a limit when reified as a specific telos. So what is this tong? What is this nung? It is the ability to be both and of any pair of opposites, as we see there. And, I'm suggesting here that desire operates along the assumption that, let's say being on this page, being rich is better than being poor, and that if we were to dig down, drill down into that, we would see that as a desire, as an assumption that either you're trading out more power for less, or that you're supplementing a pre-existing power without losing it. And that's something that could be argued about by maximalist moralities. But the Liedza passage I started with is basically saying, whatever may be the case about which is preferable there, the only thing that gives any value to any of those things is the known. And so the both and will always be more valuable than either of the two alternatives by itself. And that goes for all those other virtues too. There's a little digression here on Spinoza and Nietzsche, but I think I've touched on that, although the material's great here, right? Spinoza talks about whatever is conducive to being able to move the body in more ways is beneficial. And that, of course, means be able to move the mind in more ways, to think more thoughts, to be less limited in what can be thought, is a good. And again, that what we desire, it's a de facto, we adjust our desire. And what is desire? What is pleasure for Spinoza? Pleasure is the overcoming of a limitation of power. It's an increase in power. Power means the ability to have causal interactions and even to be affected, which we'll come back at this in a minute. Oh man, I wasn't keeping too good track of time there. Nietzsche, again, the crooked ways, the need for self-overcoming and so on. We can talk about that more. But then, right, just a little metaphysical turn, and you can see how this idea, this is also from the Liedza, the passage in red, about partiality of power, and where again, speaking of Tao and of Wu, which again just came up in May's talk, it can be nung, nung yin, nung yang, etc., as a description of Tao. But note that the positive, the negative, it can be alive, it can be dead, it can be hot, it can be cool. This is the ultimate of power. It also means it is indeterminate. That's why it ends up being wu, non-doing, uh, uh, devoid of knowledge, devoid of ability. There is nothing it does not know, nothing it cannot do. It all follows along that same sort of thread. Um, and part of the sort of transition here, I go back to a slightly earlier text, the opening of the Huainanzi. Again, the passage in red is interesting. It is contracted but able to expand, dark but able to be bright, weak but able to be strong, yielding but able to be firm. And I bring this one up briefly because I take this to be closer to the earlier elaboration of this idea in texts like the Tao Te Ching, which do privilege one side, do privilege one of the two sides of a pair of opposites. That Liedza metaphysical passage I just gave you does not. It's perfectly symmetrical, right? But this passage, as a nice kind of encapsulation of the Tao Te Ching sort of approach, privileges weakness, softness, darkness, contraction. But the reason it does so, or the reason it gives here for why these are listed, is because each of these can do the opposite. And that asymmetry, whereas the claim would be, on the contrary, that being bright and strong and being expanded cannot do the opposite. They actually block out the opposite. I refer in the paper to this kind of, that's the holy grail, because we can't, even though what we're looking for here is pure indeterminacy, there's a kind of implicit dialectic or self-contradiction to that, because indetermination itself becomes a determination. So, and as we mentioned in the Confucian case, limitation of itself is the way, precisely, ritual in that case, or wisdom or righteousness, in which there is more non-obstruction. Things become able to do more by confining themselves in one way or another. There's a net gain. It's a theme in Spinoza as well. So you have this idea of being able to move to the opposite, and a necessary overcoming where we will need a determination that is maximally indeterminate, a determination that is maximally indeterminate. This is Taoism's great discovery in a way, which is to say those determinations are these funky ones like dark, feminine, low, empty. They're still determinations, they're half of a pair, but they don't function like the other side. This is a longer discussion because there's a lot of mechanics to how that is argued, but that's a kind of second tier to this issue. So the Holy Grail problem, as I put it there. And if you want, I actually link you to a recent essay on that. But Zhuangzi, I think I'm running low on time here, but the Zhuangzi, of course, I'm going even further back to the well springs of this idea. And the thing I just want to point out in the Zhuangzi case, for those of you who are familiar with the text, is not just the Tong Ar Wei Yi here, the Tao joins them. There's that word Tong again, that makes unobstructed two opposites, and in this case, the most global possible opposites of Ke, permissible, impermissible, affirmable, negatable. But that the things that it unifies are themselves also tongs, okay, are themselves, that's the always already side of this, the de facto, that functioning itself is a kind of moving from one point to another, which is what a Tao is, right? A connecting of two opposed or differing points. And so we have the tonging of a tong, of all these various tongs, if I may, and this sort of, and that's the metaphysical picture. But the ethical description then is a threefold. This needed to be written at more length, but a little rushed. But you know that it's is it here the tong, which tongs these prior tongs, right? And even in and we get I think the same thing. I won't go through that one, but interesting use in a later chapter of the Zhuangzi, where again it's this union of opposites or interpenetration of opposites, and then the sort of human access to interpenetrating with this interpenetration of various interpenetrations, if I can put it like that. Just to act is an interpenetration. It is an expansion of a nung, of an ability, of a power. Uh, okay. And then I kind of finish up with, I think, just what, of course, there's a lot of technicalities in this Buddhist case of particular interest to me, but I think relevant not only because of the singling out once again of this word nung, but of the way this Buddhist writer Sima Zhili in the Song Dynasty connects that with stunning in souciance to a line in the Analects, Junzi Bu Qi, right? He says, he's talking about, and his gloss on that is Junzi Bu Qi Shan E Ju Neng. So cases like that described by the saying the nobleman is not a specialized tool, that's Confucius. He is capable of both good and evil. Junzi Bu Qi Neng Shan E Ju Neng, 或同恶人做诸恶事，则将其能和夫之有. That means, in English, if he sometimes goes along with an evil man in doing evil things, he is merely manifesting a power, nung, of his own. Where is there any obscuration? And this I would relate in our comparative discussion to some of that remark in the Spinoza passage where he says the ability to affect and be affected in more ways is beneficial, is an expansion of power. And we kind of have a flip here into if the Liezi passage was a second order intensification of the basic Confucian Da and Li, then this is a third order intensification of the ability to be restricted to one side is also a further skill. And this gets into, you know, sort of rather technical Buddhist dialectics about enlightenment and delusion and that sort of thing, Buddha nature and whatnot. But anyway, I think that's basically my time, and give you some overview of what I had in mind here. So I will stop there.